The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for this day and this season of Advent. Give us a deep sense of the mystery of your Son's coming as Mary's child in Holy Communion and in the Scriptures and in his words and teachings. One who is born into our hearts and ultimately pray into this world, bringing a reign of peace and justice, wisdom and love. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. It's good to see all of you. Welcome. This is the last in our Advent series with Dr. Mitzi. Mitzi is the Mary Magdalene Professor of New Testament at Memphis Theological Seminary. And in our 75th anniversary as two parishes merged into one, Grace and St. Luke's, I've asked her to do 3 stories or 3 portions of Luke's Gospel, Luke being our patron saint, Grace St. Luke's our namesake. And her last class is on one of the most interesting resurrection scenes in all the Gospels, the road to Emmaus, which will pick up on some themes that we've heard her talking about these last couple of weeks that have to do with hospitality and welcoming the stranger. And speaking of welcome, please join me in welcoming you warmly back to the Rector's Forum. Thanks, Mitzi.
I'm going to grab the music lectern. I'm assuming that's okay. What are you going to do? Throw me out? Oh, Anna says yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's a little scary. Really ought to have your notes organized. That's all I'm saying. Good morning, friends. Good morning. You know, one of the nice things about having... Yes. Okay. Okay. You didn't like the clicking? What do you? Yeah, that's right. The nice thing about being here on the Sunday before Christmas is I get to wish all of you a very blessed day. And I hope it will be that with those you love, and our tears as well as our joys, and those are always part of this season. And may they all be blessed for all of you. What we're going to do today, and the third part, is look at the end of Luke. That makes sense, right? The beginning, in the middle, and the end. What a great idea. So we're going to take a look at the end, but let me set us up to get us there, and let me clear my throat. And remind you that I'm sure you're shocked by now, I am an advocate for putting things in context. You're shocked, right? Right now. And so I remind you again that understanding the first century Roman world is so incredibly helpful for understanding the Bible. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, boy, I wish I knew how to read the Bible more for myself, or I would do more on my own. One of the best things you can do for yourself is do some reading about the first century Roman Empire. This is making a noise. Jeff, are we okay?
Yeah, I was about to ask, is anybody else hearing that?
Yes.
Let's see what I can do.
And you can get to me, if you want to email me and ask for a suggestion, I'm happy to respond. And you can get to my email through the seminary's website. So if anybody's interested in doing that, feel free. Monday night, I'm feeling a little like Adele with Holy Ghost. Trust me how much I am not like Adele. And I promise you I will not prove it to you. But the first century Roman Empire, the way Rome ordered the world, it was hierarchical, the very few on top, no middle class, an underclass, a peasant class. That's the other 95% for whom life was very difficult. Remember that religion, politics, and economics are inextricably intertwined. Our ideas of separation of church and state, you need to throw that out the window. Our ideas of a constitution, of democracy, of having a voice, throw those out the window. If you're a part of that other 95%, life is very difficult. And their propaganda, again, I think sometimes we want to think about an ancient world doesn't have media. Well, they don't have media like we do. Didn't mean they didn't have it. Rome was fabulous at its propaganda, at getting its message across, at saying this is the way life is. The gods have chosen us to bring peace and prosperity to the world. And how else would we be on top of the world if the gods hadn't chosen us? That's actually not uncommon in our own time. Sometimes the winners are always proclaiming that the gods have chosen us or God has chosen us. Well, see, the story of Luke is a little different, or that tells a story about God that is different from that. For our Jewish forebears, they understood that God was the one who heard the cries of the slaves down in Egypt. And God was the one who saw those that everybody else considered invisible. And God was the one who heard those whom others had made voiceless and powerless. And the story of Luke is the story of God sending the Messiah to fulfill God's long-made promise to renew all of creation, which would include judging those who've done evil and vindicating the righteous ones, renewing creation to bring the peace. You all know the great Jewish word shalom. It's a wonderful word. And it's not just the absence of war. It's a genuine sense of harmony between us and with God. And by the way, in Jewish thinking, you cannot be at peace with God if you aren't also at peace with one another. You can't. We are interconnected. God has brought us together. And so as Luke tells the story, that God is fulfilling that promise, sending the Messiah to inaugurate that long-awaited fulfillment of the apocalyptic turning point of the ages. I think you need to go out today and throw that phrase around somewhere. Okay? And people will think, what did y'all do in church today? But the apocalyptic turning point of the ages was their understanding, our ancient Jewish forebears' understanding of what God was doing. And so the Christmas story, we looked the first week, is not a story in and of itself. And it wouldn't be a bad one if it was. But it is the beginning of something much larger than simply that story. The apocalyptic turning point of the ages had come. And what that looks like, according to Luke, is that the lowly ones are lifted up. And they are welcome to Christ's table. Last week we looked at the meal scenes a little bit in Luke. It's how Luke chooses to tell the story. And Jesus is always eating with the wrong people. Whether it's with tax collectors and sinners, or also accepting an invitation to eat with the Pharisees. Because I don't know about you, but I always figure his disciples and all those tax collectors and sinners, when he decided he would go eat with the Pharisees, they were all like, you're going to go eat with who? Because we all do that, don't we? Those who are other, I don't care if it's a different other, we all got an other. One of the great sermons I ever heard in my life was on the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is one of Luke's parables. And the preacher said, you are the person in the ditch. And the Good Samaritan is the one person in the world that you would rather die in that ditch than have that person be your hero. And then he said, and we've all got somebody like that. I'm going to make a confession here. He began to list some possibilities. This was the middle 80s when I heard this. Okay? So he listed some possibilities. If you're this person, it might be this. So he said, if you're a woman in ministry, it might be middle 80s, right? He said, it might be Jerry Falwell. And the first thought that went through my head, he better not ever lay a finger on me. And then my next thought was, oh my God, Paul is right. We all have a The preacher's name was Paul. So that's really Luke's story. That's how he says when the kingdom comes, when the apocalyptic turning point of the ages comes, lowly are lifted up. We're all sitting at the table together. I don't know if you've ever given thought to the ways in which our creation of those people, and again, we all do that, but that very creation of those people is what keeps us afraid. It launches violence. It makes us treat others as if they were not children of God. And what Jesus comes along, if he's going to bring peace, we have to sit at the table together. A few years ago, a woman came to our seminary, was talking with some of our students, and I don't know if you do this, but periodically I'll hear somebody say something and I'll think, I wish I'd thought of that first. It makes me mad. You said that before I can think of it. And this is one of those where she said, I don't want to be a part of a church where everybody looks alike, thinks alike, acts alike, and believes alike. I want to be a part of a church where we are very, very different, and we sit down at the table together. Now, let's be honest, that's not easily done. Because, those people eat that food, or whatever it is, how quickly we start doing that. But the goal is thus, and Luke really tells us about that. Those meal scenes are marvelous in Luke's gospel for helping us understand Luke's understanding of Jesus and what the coming of the kingdom looked like. So today we take a look at the ending of Luke. How then does Luke conclude this story? One of the thoughts I had this week when I was pondering the work for today was the way I had joked last week about Jesus waiting until the Sabbath to do something, because it always got their noses so out of joint for him to do stuff on the Sabbath. And I have a lot of fun with that, because it is remarkable how many times gospel writers will say, Jesus did this, and it was the Sabbath. And so then they're not only irritated because he did this, they're irritated because he did this on this particular day. So I was joking about that last week, and it occurred to me this week that maybe I ought not joke about that. And the reason is because it's one of the primary reasons that they killed him. When Rome orders the world in such a way, when the very few on top rule the world and protect their power and interests in a huge variety of ways, not the least of which is insisting that this order is a part of the way we keep the peace. This order is what God wants us to do, or the gods, if you're the Romans. When they do that and somebody challenges that, it makes that person dangerous. The temple authorities in Jerusalem cooperated with Rome, and they reinforced that power structure. They just put religious language on it. So the priests are at the top of the power structure, and God ordained that. And how do you know God ordained it? Because after all, we're priests and we are in the temple and you're not. And we're much more pure than you are. And there are purity rules, which is not about, by the way, for those of you who read that about clean and pure and that kind of stuff in the New Testament, that is not about hepatitis B and washing your hands, every time you walk past a sink. It's about ritual purity. It was about setting yourself apart for God. It was a symbolic way of showing that you belonged to God. And so those purity rules were also very much about place. The priests had higher purity rules, and they did them, and that made them better than you. And Jews had them, and that made them better than Gentiles, because we're always doing that. So the temple authorities concurred and they collaborated with Rome to keep this power structure in place and protect their power and protect their interests. And here's the reality of that world, as best we can tell. Most, I don't know if I can say that, I can certainly say many of our Jewish forebears in that peasant class didn't buy it. They didn't believe the propaganda, but they were afraid to say anything. Rome made sure they were afraid. And when you don't say, and nobody says, then a certain ethos gets created, and then you may think it, but then you look around and nobody's saying anything, And so you think, okay, well, I must be the crazy one. Does this sound vaguely familiar to anything you've ever encountered, right? We're really good at this. By the way, if you want a classic illustration of exactly this dynamic, read The Emperor's New Clothes. Right? Yeah, I heard some of you chuckling, right? But he nails it. Because the propaganda was that the only people who couldn't see the clothes were people who were stupid or who were unworthy of their place in the empire, so nobody wants to say, dude's naked. Nobody wants to say that because they kind of look stupid. Nobody wants to look stupid. So everybody kind of cooperates in the farce. And that's exactly how propaganda works. And our Jewish forebears, as best we can tell, was not buying what Rome was selling. They weren't even buying what the temple authorities were selling. But they were afraid and they didn't say. And then after a while, this ethos is created. So that one of my best understandings of what Jesus did was he came along and he said out loud, and he lived out loud, if you will, that Rome is wrong and the temple authorities are wrong, and that what you thought all along is spot on. The guy's naked. To use that illustration. And all those folks were going, I knew it! I knew that! But they've been afraid to say. And by the way, they had reason to be fearful. I'm not knocking them. They had reason to be afraid. Rome was brutal. But what Jesus did, therefore, made him incredibly dangerous. Because he was going to expose. He was exposing that the emperor has no clothes on. And that made him dangerous. And so, as we know, the religious and political authorities conspired to kill him. Which is why I thought this week I probably ought not be joking about all that Sabbath stuff, because this is where it leads. So they conspired to eliminate the threat and to try to terrorize the population as they do that. Crucifixion was done publicly. It was horrific. It was done to scare the bejesus out of the population. Any of the rest of you got bright ideas? This is what happens to people who have bright ideas. And I have to think that for the women who witnessed the crucifixion and for the other followers of Jesus, when they heard that the deed was done and Jesus was dead, I have to think that they thought there was no apocalyptic turning point of the ages after all. That what Jesus had announced had been a nice dream, but it wasn't anything more than that. I don't know how often we go and stand with them on Friday night and all day Saturday before we get to Easter Sunday morning. But it had to have been among the most excruciating hours that any human being has ever endured. We jump quickly from Good Friday to Easter Sunday almost because it's unbearable. And even when we do the vigil and we're aware that we do it rather quickly because it's painful. If you go stand with them and try to imagine being Mary Magdalene, try to imagine being Peter, having denied Jesus, just like Jesus said he would, and he promised he would never, and he did. And don't you almost can't stand yourself when you do that, right? My mom has that phrase. Mom will say, I've had one of those days when I can't stand myself. You have to figure Peter was there, right? So you have to think that Friday afternoon and evening and all day Saturday, there is no apocalyptic turning point in the ages. Nothing's changing. Rome wins again. And it must have been crushing. But the good news is Luke gives us chapter 24. And that's a thanks be to God moment, right? So let's take a look at Luke 24. But first of all, isn't that three-letter word great? You're doing all this stuff in but. Everything's looking turn. You ever had anybody say, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but. So what are they fixing to do? Right? Okay. So we've had this really horrific story in chapter 23. And chapter 24 begins, but. This time we're glad. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn. Here's a curiosity about Luke's telling. The other Gospels will say, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, which is a very telling way to convey the story. It was dark in so many ways, right? When those women were walking to the tomb, right away in the pre-dawn darkness of an area where their beloved friend had been, murdered. How's that for dark? But Luke chooses to tell it this way: on the first day of the week, at early dawn. Just file that away. I'll come back to it. Okay? The women came to the tomb taking the spices that they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. First of all, were you going in that tomb? I don't think you could have gotten me in that tomb for anything. By the way, do you know what they had to be thinking? I mean, they had to be thinking right now that Rome has come and taken the body. And that they're going to add desecration of the body to what has already been done to him. That's what they have to be thinking when they first find the tomb open, and then they walk in and it's empty. Thankfully, we know that's not the case. We know there's going to be an angel. Actually, Luke tells us there are two angels there with the news to the women that Jesus is not here. He has been raised, just as he told you, and the story is off and running. Let me pause in the story to see if I can help you grasp the enormity of this claim. And I'm not talking about he was dead and now he's alive again. It's bigger than that. In my experience in church, we haven't always grasped that. No, let me rephrase. We have not grasped that in my experience in church. Remember me I keep telling you this is the story of the apocalyptic turning point of the ages? Okay. Resurrection for our ancient forebears. Resurrection was an apocalyptic event. It happened at the end of the present age and the beginning of the age to come. Because if you died before the age to come comes, you don't miss it. If you are among the righteous ones, you don't miss the blessings. If you did evil, you don't miss judgment. You will be resurrected to share in that moment when it comes. It is an apocalyptic event. Now, remember that first century people had never... See, we've grown up with the idea of resurrection. Those of us who grow up in church, we do it every year. And if you're like me, it started early. You know, with that dress on, my mother always put on me when I was little. And the patent leather shoes that hurt my feet. You know, a lot of little girls love that stuff, and I was, because this will not shock you, I'm guessing. I didn't love that. See, it troubles me a little that y'all know me that well, but whatever. You know, but I remember that, and the big deal that Easter was in my church and is in this church, and I loved all of it. Easter baskets and chocolate Easter eggs, one of the greatest inventions in all of human history, as far as I'm concerned. But in the first century world, none of that existed. And nobody had ever said that somebody was already resurrected, because resurrection happened at the end of the present age and the beginning of the age to come. They believed in resurrection by the first century, but not in terms of the idea that it was already happening. So when those women went to the tomb and it is empty, and the angels tell them, Jesus is not here, he has been resurrected, that is enormous. This is not like Lazarus, who walked out of the tomb the same as he was before. He was going to die again. This is not that. He is resurrected, and the implications are enormous. Let me see if I can spell them out. See, if resurrection happens at the end of the present age and the beginning of the age to come, and Jesus is resurrected, then what? The age to come has come. His announcement that the kingdom of God has drawn near, not future tense, has drawn near, is dramatically confirmed. He is resurrected, and the implications are simply enormous. The renewal of creation that God had promised is underway, as Jesus said it was. The kingdom has drawn near, as Jesus said it was. That cross didn't cause the dream to die. God's life is still at work in the world. It's enormous. How long do you think it took for that to set in? Because I'm thinking, you don't just like that and grasp those implications, right? Let me work on my throat. So we get verse 11, a little down. I didn't read the story of the women do that, but here's verse 11. The women, of course, hear the message from the angel. They go running back to the others and tell them, verse 11, but those words seemed to them an idle tale, and they didn't believe them. Of course they didn't. Who could believe this? Nobody has ever made this kind of claim before. And not only that, they didn't expect it. Okay? So, they don't believe them. Of course they don't. Because this is too big. And that leads us then to the story that we're going to focus on today. Verse 13. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. I don't know about you, but my impression is they had just hit a wall. I mean, they'd been followers of Jesus. He'd been horribly executed. They were grieving that when the women came back from the tomb with this news, and it's like, okay, I can't do this anymore. I'm out of here. I sort of get them, I do that. I have moments when I'm like, okay, I'm done here, and I gotta get out. And that seems to be where they were. So they are heading to Emmaus, talking with each other about all that is going on. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself. Try to read this as if you've never read the story before. Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him, which, by the way, is probably a great gift. Because if you looked over and said, OMG, right? I don't think they'd have been walking to Emmaus anymore. I think they'd have been running with all they were worth, right? But of course, the other piece of this, their eyes were kept from recognizing them. Scholars have a great term for this. You really should get to be a scholar sometime because scholars are great people. So, you know what scholars call this? This is great. You ready? Non-recognition. Somebody got a PhD to come up with that term. Remember I said a minute ago, there's things I wish I'd thought of first? This is not one of them. But here's what this is supposed to remind us. He isn't like Lazarus. He didn't just walk out of the tomb the same as before. One of my students once said, in my church we often talk about resurrection as if Jesus woke up on Easter morning, stretched and yawned, peeled off the grave clothes like they were pajamas, and walked out pretty much the same as he was before. And again, that was my experience in church as well. She sort of captured it. That's not the story. He is resurrected. That's enormous. And if you're resurrected, it isn't just like before. You are you, but there's more to the you now than there was. Paul makes an effort to try to describe this earlier than Luke, but in one of his letters to the Corinthians, he calls what happens a spiritual body. Have you ever heard that phrase and thought, you really can't put those two words together? Because if something is material and bodily, it's not spiritual. And if it's spiritual, it's not material and bodily. But Paul puts those two words together because he's trying to describe what at the end of the day is indescribable for us. He is resurrected. So they don't recognize him at first. And of course, Jesus, being Jesus, takes full advantage. So he says to them, so what are you talking about? Actually, if he was a good Southerner, how would he say that? What y'all talking about? And he's like being nonchalant. Don't you love this? About Jesus. So they tell him, here's Luke's telling. They stood still. Okay, it's a great picture. They're walking along. He asked them that question. Do they go, really? If they knew how to do that, really, they would have done it, right? Okay? So whatever their first century sort of thing really was, that's what they did. It says they stood still, looking sad, and one of them, whose name was Cleopas, said to him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem?" Oh, see, good, you laughed. Jesus is a stranger in Jerusalem. Yes and no, right? Okay? Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have taken place there in these last days? And he said to them, what things? What, you mean me getting crucified? Hey, great. What things? Okay. Some days I go, okay, do I like this about Jesus or is this annoying? Okay. What things? And they answered the things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and they crucified him. But we had hope. Hear the past tense. We had hope that he was the one to redeem Israel. Two things. The past tense of their hope. And the second thing is to redeem Israel. Notice how small their vision is. To redeem Israel. That's a good thing, but that's like, Israel was like this really, really tiny country in the world. We had hope. He was the one to redeem Israel. And Jesus then responds, how foolish you are, and slow of heart to understand all that the prophets have said. And then Luke says he began to talk to them about the scriptures and what the scriptures had taught. Can't you see these guys that are walking along? They were the ones initially telling him what was what. And now he's telling them what's what as they're walking along. Okay? And they still don't recognize him. Keep that in mind as well. All right. What happens then as he is talking with them, they're walking 7 miles. How long does it take to walk 7 miles? A couple hours maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. So for a couple hours, he's telling them stuff, okay, as they go along. And they get finally to Emmaus, to the village where they were headed. And he walked ahead as if he were going on, which, again, always makes me chuckle because I'm thinking he has no intention of going on. I think if they hadn't called him back, he might have taken a few steps and gone, hey, would y'all mind if I just spent the night? I think, just to get that. But fortunately for him, he didn't have to. Okay? He makes as if to go along, but they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us, because it's almost evening. The day is now nearly over. It's dangerous in this world to walk out on these roads at night. Do you remember whenever there's been a power outage, you ever struck by how dark the world is? We forget that because something's always on. Right? And then I remember when we've had massive power outages, after storms or something, and I'll stand sometimes and look at all of Midtown in dark, And it's so strange. Okay, that was normal for them. They didn't have street lights. And they didn't have refrigerators humming. and the night light stuck into the outlet and all those things that we do. So the roads are incredibly dark and therefore dangerous. So they invite him to stay with them. And as my dad would say if he were here, and now the plot thickens. So they urged him to stay, and he did so. So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, and here is Luke's last great meal scene. Remember again, it's one of the ways that Luke chooses to convey his understanding of Jesus. All those meal scenes in Luke. Next time you read through Luke, every time you come to a meal scene, pay extra attention because Luke is telling you something significant. Okay? And here we are again. When he was at table with them, he took the bread. First of all, you know what's wrong with this story? He's the guest. But he's acting as if he is the host. Okay, that's your first clue. He took the bread, blessed, and broke it, and gave it to them. Is that making you think of anything? Of course it is. There is a reason that Luke tells this story in meal scenes. And there is a reason that believers early on celebrated Eucharist together, and we still do so 2,000 years later. This is Eucharistic language. He took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were open and they recognized him. You know, there are ways to tell stories so that the story isn't just humorous, isn't just elegant, isn't just entertaining. There are ways to tell a story so that it sort of reaches out and grabs hold of you somewhere deep inside. And Luke has done that here. They're just walking along talking about what's been happening in Jerusalem. They invite him to stay because it's scary out at night. He sits at table with them. He takes the bread and blesses it and breaks it and gives it to them. And their eyes were open and they recognized him. First of all, what do you think that moment was like? How do you breathe? We talk about the deer in the headlights kind of look. They don't have headlights, but it's the same thing, right? How do you take that? But beyond that, the way Luke tells the story is supposed to evoke for us that one of the places, maybe the premier place, that we're invited to recognize the presence of the risen Christ with us, is in the moment of Eucharist. And I say that because, again, my experience in church has been that the emphasis in Eucharist has been on the crucifixion. And for understandable reasons. The body is broken, the blood is shed. But Luke invites us to see this moment, this Eucharistic moment, as the place where we recognize the presence of the risen Christ in our midst. John's Gospel, by the way, also uses Eucharistic language in a resurrection story. John chapter 21, if any of you want to go and check on that. So we have two of our Gospels very intentionally using Eucharistic language in their resurrection stories. And with that, let me share a thought with you from one of my favorite New Testament scholars. And I don't laugh at Louisa Chatron. If she says it, I believe it. She's that right. And you know the reason I like her, by the way? She's shorter than I am. I love her. great minds I've ever been privileged to read, she says it's not just Luke and John, but that in all of the New Testament, Eucharist is a resurrection meal. It is the place where resurrection is experienced, which means that it is the place where God's life, God's way of inviting us to be together, and the renewal of all creation is experienced in our sharing of Eucharist. The early believers, where table fellowship prior to Jesus had been so exclusive, you ate with people like yourself. Same class, same gender, same tribe or race or family. In many instances, same occupation group. You ate with people like yourself so that their table fellowship actually reflected Rome's ordering of the world. Unless you were Jesus. Because Jesus ate with anybody who wanted a seat at that table. And that becomes exactly the picture for those first believers of what God is doing in the world. The renewal of all creation. The erasing of the lines that create us and them. And when we erase those lines, we make the shalom of God possible. It's not easy. I mean, let's begin. I don't want to kid ourselves. You know, sometimes we do we're just all going to be one big happy family. Okay, well, good luck with that. Because it's not easy sitting down at table with people who look differently and act differently and believe differently than you do. And particularly if they are not particularly gracious about your presence there either. You know, it's not easy. Let's be honest. But when we do that, we are mirroring the world. The renewal of creation that God is doing. And those first believers, this became their uniting ritual almost immediately after Jesus. It is the place where resurrection is experienced, Shatroff says. And then she goes on, let me read it for you. She said, here at Christ's table, we have communion with the risen Christ, whose body was broken and whose blood was shed precisely because he believed in God's renewal of all creation. Precisely because he understood what God was doing and was part of that, inaugurated that, lived it out loud. His body was broken and his blood was shed. And so when we sit at table with that Christ, we sit with one another enacting again that vision. Here at this table, she says, we welcome all our brothers and sisters, which is why when we do Eucharist well, we make visible what that was saying. We make visible our belief that the apocalyptic turning point of the ages has come. And that God is at work renewing creation. Despite all our efforts sometimes to thwart what God is doing. You know, sometimes God's biggest hurdles are us. But God is at work. And when we do Eucharist well, we make visible our belief in what God is doing and our willing participation in God's renewal of all creation. Shatroff says, therefore, that we should read all of the New Testament through the lens of resurrection. And again, in my experience, we've done a lot more reading it through the lens of crucifixion. And that's not an unimportant story. I mean, need I say that? But what if we shift our emphasis just a little? And this becomes the primary lens for Eucharist, for our understanding of what God is doing, and for our invitation to participate with God in what God is doing. The apocalyptic renewal of all creation has come. These folks on the road to Emmaus who did not recognize him until the Eucharist moment happened. And then their eyes were opened. And then they recognized him. Eucharist becomes that moment for us if we are willing to receive it thus. Okay, now, with that as our context, I'm going to invite one more thing. Let's go back to the beginning of Luke. Against all of that, Luke's telling the story. Let's hear again these words from the beginning. Gabriel's words to Mary. And now, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Or the angels to the shepherds. I am bringing you good news of great joy for all. For to you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Or Zechariah's words after the birth of his son John. By the tender mercy of our God. I'm just going to say that one again because I love it. By the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us. You remember me telling you I thought there was a reason that on Easter morning Luke said at early dawn rather than it was still dark? Here's why. Chapter 1, Zechariah promises that the dawn will break. In chapter 24, the dawn breaks. By the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us, to give light to those who sit in the darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. Now you know why we sing joyfully and why we say with the angels, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, on earth shalom, to all those who are open to our cause. Sing boldly this week, whether you sing like Adele or not.